So this week we will have a presentation on multilayer perceptron, which is a basic model of neural networks. So let's first start with some modeling to present you the basic ideas behind multilayer perceptron. So let's first talk about natural intelligence. Natural intelligence, which is found in the brain of humans, in the brain of animals. So we know that our intelligence, the intelligence of human being, of living being, is mostly in the brain. And this brain is a machine. We can see this as a machine. We can kind of a device, a biological device, which is able of parallel and distributed computing. Because basically, you know, in a brain we have a bunch of neurons, which are cells, which are connected in some ways. And these connections are, you know, we have millions of cells, but we have billions of connections between the cells. And these connections allow some electric flow, electronic current that is flowing through the brain. And this is done totally in parallel in a distributed way. So basically, there is no synchronization through a clock, for example, like what we found on computers. And this device, this machinery is able of learning. You know, we are able to learn from experience, and we are able to generalize, to extract from few experience the general notions that can be applied then to new situations that hasn't been seen so far. And this is also a machinery that is able of adaptation. You know, depending on the context where it is acting, our brain is able to adapt itself to function in new situations according to different parameters. So we know that human beings, that living beings, are able of adapting themselves to the environment. And we are also facing a neurotolerant system because, you know, the cells are not eternal. You know, the neuron cells are dying. They are replacing. Just the aging process in the brain is affecting quite the brain functioning. You know, many elements are kind of stopping working, so they are not working anymore over time. But still, the brain is functioning relatively well. There's like no strict, the functioning may be degrading, but it is relatively tolerating this different the fact that some cells are dying and some elements are no more functioning like it used to be. And also, in terms of energy consumption, the capacity that we have in human brains is kind of very important, and the energy required to support this is quite low compared to electronic devices that we have so far. Even though our brain is consuming basically 25% of the energy that we are consuming, the equivalent in watts is relatively low. It's kind of quite efficient compared to what we have with more electric devices. So this is a nice biological computational machine that from which we are getting inspiration since the beginning of artificial intelligence, and we still are being inspired a lot of. For instance, if we look at the biological neuron that is presented here, we can see that we are facing a cell. This is a basic cell, but has the characteristic of being connected to many other cells. So through dendrites, we have connections. So we have an axon, which is somehow the output of the neural cell, and we have many dendrites that are connected to the other cells. So the model of a biological neuron is basically to have an accumulator. So we are accumulating energy potential that is coming from the other cells, and once we reach some threshold, the cell is discharging itself in the axon, which is sending electric signal to the other cells that are connected at the axon. And as such, you know, we have all these neurons that are running somehow, if you can say, in parallel, which are accumulating some energy potential, and are discharging themselves in an asynchronous way. And this is what is making the mind, what is making the flow of, I would say, information elements are going through these cells, up to even making some reasoning, some way of controlling the body, and so on. And so we are getting inspired by this model of a biological neuron to design an artificial neuron model, which is super simple, which is really a simplification of the biological model. And basically, we are facing an accumulator, which is a linear model that is presented here. So we have this part, which corresponds to what is here between parentheses. So this is the mechanic that is accumulating, I would say, signal from other neurons. And this signal is modulated by the weights. So we have different weights. So each weight is associated to a connection. These connections are usually connected either to the input or to other neurons. But let's say that we are connected to the input. So we have the input. This input is weighted according to the values, is accumulated with the summation here. And then it is going out in A here. This output is given to a function, a transfer function that is transforming the A value into a Y value. And this is the output of the model. So we can see that this artificial neural model to be a simplified mathematical modeling of the biological neuron we see just before. And as such, we can qualify this in terms of what we saw so far in the course as a linear discriminator that is put inside a transfer function, much like what we saw with logistic regression. So we have this linear model here, which is not different from what we saw before. In the matricial notation, we have the things, the same formulation on the right. And we have the f function that is acting on that. So we have different possibilities as transfer functions. We have the linear function, which is basically doing nothing. So it just pass through of the output being equal to the linear model. We have the sigmoid function, which has been developed for the logistic regression. So this is the same function that we had with logistic regression. So basically, a neuron here is a logistic regressor. And this function is basically taking the linear model, putting this into a function that is 1/1 plus exponential minus a, which is the value of the linear model. We also have a step function. This is basically providing one if the linear model is giving an output that is 0 or positive, and 0 otherwise. So when the value of the linear model is negative, we have a 0 as output. And there are some other transfer functions, but the point here is that we see that these neurons, so these individual neurons are connected to other neurons. And all this set of different neurons is making a neural network. And so our neural network is kind of emulating the brain with these basic models of neurons. When we have what we call a single layer network, we are talking about neurons that are all connected to the input. So basically, it's a set of linear models or logistic regression models that are all connected to the same input with many outputs. So we have one output per neuron. When we are talking about multi-layer networks, the idea is that we have neurons that have as input other neurons. So the neurons is feeding other neurons that are feeding other neurons. So each layer, because we are organizing this as layers of neurons that are stacked one in front of the others. So we have many layers of them. So that is making up a multi-layer network. So let's first talk about one layer neural network here. So we see that we have 1 to k neurons. So basically we have k neurons overall. So, and each of these neurons are connected to input, and the input is of size r here. And so, and as such, we have weights. So every neuron has a set of weights. Let's say for like the neuron 1, we have these weights here. So these weights are giving the connections to the input here for that neuron. And the same thing for the others, like the last one, we have all these connections that are connecting the inputs to that neuron here. And each neuron is giving an output value that is the linear model, which is applied in the transfer function. So this transfer function is giving us the output of that neuron. So a single layer network is basically a set of linear discriminants. There's no differences, except that we have a transfer function like we had with logistic regression. So this model is unable to correctly classify non-linearly separable data. So this is not a model that is able to deal with that. We have the same limitations that with usual linear discriminants. But when we are cascading, when we are stacking the linear discriminants one over the other, so in multiple layers, we've got something that is much stronger. So we are able to classify then non-linearly separable data with a multi-layer network. And as such, we can see that our network is in fact a model, but we can see that it is in fact a set of many simple models. So each neurons is a basic classifier, is a simple classifier, but we are putting this into a network, and that network is giving us a much powerful model that is able to take advantage of each of these single classifiers. And we can also see this from the perspective of kernel methods. You know, when we talk about a basis function, that basis function is mapping the input space into a new space where we are applying linear discriminants. And as such, we can see that each layer is a kind of kernel or kind of basis function that is mapping the input of that layer into a new output. And that new output may be of a bigger dimensionality or not, it depends. It depends on the number of neurons that we have on that layer. And that new space is used as input to another model, which can be a linear discriminant. So basically, we can repeat or reproduce the model of linear discriminants apply after a basis function and being able then to classify non-linearly separable data. And then during data processing, contrary to what we have in brains, the processing is not asynchronous nor completely in parallel. It's more like from one layer to another. So basically, we have the input, and this input is fed to the input layer, which is processing the data, providing some outputs that are fed then to the next layer, and then to the next layer, and so on. So we have some kind of sequential through layers way of processing the information. So that's why we are often talking about feed-forward network, where we are propagating forward the information from the input, like here, to the output here. So we have in this illustration a 3-layer network. So we have 3 layers of neurons, and each layer has different number of layers. It doesn't have to be the same number. And as such, we have an input of D. So we have facing data of dimensionality D. And this data is given to the first layer of neurons here, which is processing it. So transforming the input into a new space. So this transformation gives us that thing here. So we are now in a new space of dimensionality that we call here R1. R1 is basically the number of neurons that we have on the first layer, which is then the input of the second layer, which is making a new transformation of that space into a new space here. That is the output of the second layer, which has a dimensionality equivalent to the number of neurons on that layer, which is again the input of the third layer. So we have this as input of what we have as output. And usually in classification, we have as much output as we have classes. So if we are dealing with 10 classes, for example, we have 10 outputs, but it can vary depending on the application. And as such, we have a number of neurons on that layer that is equivalent to the number of outputs that we need.